Alrighty, so like I said, I wanted to kind of redo that lecture for you guys. I found myself with a bit of time to do it. So I just wanted, like I said, I wanted to finish these off for you. Now, one of the things you have to be aware of is that when you have separate objects, there's no real default way to combine UVs in Blender. So it is something you have to be aware of. The UV wrapping tools are fairly strong. There's plenty of add-ons out there, of course, but it is kind of one of those slightly weird things, right? When you join objects, as we saw kind of in that preview lecture, it had kind of two UV sets here. And you can't really combine them per se. You can't really copy UVs from one to the other. So in this case, one of the things we could do before we get there is we could really just kind of, and I'll kind of do it for both just so you can see what happens when you join them. But remember, we need to add seams, right? And you can kind of see I've already did a bit of a quick UV unwrap on them, but we'll show the whole process again. Now remember, of course, in this case, you can turn the eyeball off and on up here. Remember, you have your little balls right up here for your different shader types: wireframe, shaded, texture, right? That's really easy with your material preview. It doesn't really matter, particularly between these two, which ones you have on, but you might find it a little easier to see your seams in regular shading mode. Now remember, to set up seams, right, you just select your object, hit 2 for edge loop mode, right? And you can kind of already see I did some UV unwrapping on them, right? And we really just go in here and double left click, right? Double left click, shift double left click, and we're kind of trying to grab the same ones on each one here. Shift double left click, shift double left click. Now, of course, at that point you can right click, right? And that's going to bring up your edge context menu. And what you can do is you can mark seam. And there you've got a seam. Now in this case, we can see that we probably want to kind of put a seam on the bottom here, just so that these little kind of feet can pop off. So double left click, right? Shift double left click, shift double left click. Remember, double left click, since we're using industry compatible mode, does edge loop, right? And shift, of course, adds to selections. So shift double left click, and then of course right click, mark seam. And now you have your seams set up for that, right? Of course, remember, if you go to the green triangle, you can kind of open up this little UV map section, and you could double click to name this, right? And I kind of called it legs the other day. Once you've got that all selected, any edit mode will work, right? So if you're in edge mode already, you can just do Control A to select all, right? Select all. It's right there, Control A. And then, of course, you can see these are already unwrapped, but what we can do is we can easily go in here and just UV, and we can go to unwrap, unwrap. And you'll see that it basically unwraps those for us, right? Now remember, all your selection types work in here, right? So that's vertex, right? 1, 2, as long as your cursor, right? Your cursor is context sensitive. So if your cursor's in this viewport, it'll be doing these. If it's in this one, it'll be doing these. But you'll see it's still basically the same. 1 for vertices, 2 for edges. You can still select edge loops. You notice your move, rotate, and scale tools still work. 3 for faces. All your selection tools still work in here too. And 4 is actually object level, but in UVs, it actually grabs what are called islands, which are kind of where you put your seams at. And you can see by putting those seams where we did, these are kind of peeled off almost like the labels on bottles, right? Now in this case, because we're not going to do any heavy geometric texturing, these UVs are going to be fine, right? We can kind of turn on checkerboard material preview on, and they're low distortion, right? That's why we have that checkerboard material assigned. We did it in previous videos. So you can see those work pretty well. We'll talk about later on other ones where we might want to straighten our UVs up a little bit more. But for these, this is going to work fine, right? We're just going to put some like wood or metal, rough metal texture on it and stuff like that. So it's not really going to matter too much. So there's our UVs for that. So now I'm going to go to 4 for object mode, and I'm going to bring up the head struts, right? And I'll turn kind of the eyeball off, right, for the legs. And you can see I'd kind of already done those as well. And you can see like we can always switch between these, right? And I'll go to 2 for edge mode, right? Make sure to select object, 2 for edge mode. And I'm just going to put these edges back in here as well. Now in this case, what I kind of did was I just selected kind of these edge loops on the top, just to kind of pop the tops off. It's always a good idea to have the tops and bottoms popped off and then like a seam kind of connecting them. It's really kind of treating this part of it like a label for a bottle, right? You peel the seam off and you peel it back off to be a rectangle, basically, or close to a rectangle. And then these tops kind of end up being their own little kind of, tops. So shift double left click. Oops, that's not the one I wanted. Remember, control double left click will deselect an edge loop, right? In Blender with industry compatible, shift does most of the heavy work for adding and subtracting, but occasionally control you can use for deselect, like for edge loops or like circle select. So shift double left click, And of course I can right click to mark seam. There we go. And we can go down here, double left click, shift double left click, shift double left click, shift double left click, right click, mark seam. Remember, right click brings up your context menu. In this case, we're in edge mode, so it's your edge tools, which includes mark seam. If you want to get rid of the seams, you can clear seam, right? So mark seam, clear seam. There we go. And then really we just want to add maybe a little bit extra one just to kind of connect these two, right? And you can do it manually. Just shift left click, shift left click, shift left click, right click, mark seam. But there is the ability to select an edge at the top and an edge at the bottom. And of course, if there's more edges, it's even cooler. But there is a select feature in select link called shortest path, right? And what that does is it basically selects in between, the shortest path in between, which usually just does in between. If you've got a really complicated area, it sometimes finds its own path, so you have to be a little careful of that, but most of the time you're fine otherwise, right? So of course, right click, mark seam, and then kind of just the same thing here. And like I said, sometimes with only 3, it's probably just as easy to grab them manually, right? But if you have a quick key setup for it also, it can be pretty quick to just go up here and then just hit that quick key, which I do because I use that tool a decent amount, right? But remember, you can manually select them, but there is that in select link shortest path. Right click, mark seam. There we go. And then of course, we're already in edge mode, so Control A for select all. But remember, that is in the select all menu, right? And then of course, we can go to UV, unwrap, unwrap. And we can see low distortion. Now here is going to be our issue, right? So if I turn the visibility on for the other thing, we can actually take objects and combine them, right? So I've already got this object selected. I could hold down shift and I could select this object, so they're both selected, right? If I right click, right, because we're in object mode, right? 4 for object mode, but remember they are right here. Left click, and where shift adds to selections. I can then right click, and of course it brings up object context menu, and there's join in there. And what join does is it makes them one object, but you notice how both UV sets are here. And I haven't found a stock default way to combine them, right, or even copy UVs. Technically there's copy features, but they don't seem to be able to do it. So one of the things that you have to be aware of is that you might delete one of these, or just plan appropriately, right? Because we kind of saw that with these different UV sets, you know, like if I hit 3 for A, Control A, you see how there's a lot of space wasted, right? And at the end of the day, that doesn't mean your UVs are bad. It just means that these are pixels that aren't going to be used, right? Anywhere there's no UVs, those are pixels that just aren't going to show up on your model. So it's less efficient in terms of using your pixels. So sometimes you just have to look at your object and see which objects can be joined and unwrapped as one piece to maximize how many pixels are used. And in this case, we can kind of see, you know, this could be maximized better. Now in this case, you can select one of these, and you can actually kind of, and which one it shows up is kind of the, you know, kind of usually the camera render thing. But you can click minus, and that will actually get rid of one of them, just like plus will add one, right? At this point, I could maybe, you know, relabel this. Actually, let's just keep it legs, because it's legs here as well. And what I could do is all the seams are still set up, so the seams are still preserved. So in particular, if you don't, you're not worried about kind of re-unwrapping, right? Because the seams are working, and you just did a standard unwrap. We could just go right back in here and go unwrap and re-unwrap all of the parts, right? Now in this case, we can do Control A to select all in here. And there's still some space wasted. So I might just go to the UV menu here and pack islands, right? And what that can do is that can kind of repack all of these to maximize the space. And in this case, you see how all the checkerboards still look like about the same size, right? If you had like an area, like maybe if I scaled up a lot here, like that is not wrong per se, but that does mean that this particular leg is getting a lot, in this case more of the texture, it's outside of it, but it's getting a lot of the texture, whereas the other ones, if they're not overlapping with it, are getting a lot less. So you'll get like nice resolution here and blurry resolution here. So usually what we like to do is kind of, it's called texel density, texture element. We usually like to kind of, if we can, keep that closer to 1, right, where all of them are basically getting about the same. It's okay if it's not 100% because you notice how there's very little discrepancy there, but you see how we're just making and taking advantage of a lot more UV stuff. And now we have pack islands. And generally, though, I'd probably make sure your objects are all joined before you unwrap because you'd hate to have to go back and do a lot of fixing or re-unwrapping a bunch of times. But I figured it'd be cool to kind of show how you could join, and that you might run into that issue if you even wrap these independently. All right, so I think that's a great way to kind of have the chair finished off, because we kind of have all the other stuff UV unwrapped. And that is the chair.